Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Connect Conference 2021 Day 4, brought to you by Huawei.
Good morning and thank you to all of those who are attending today's webinar. We are so excited to be here. Thank you so much to the Digital Council Africa for inviting us. My name is Louise Martin and I am from a company called Estate Living. We work with residential communities, property developers and individuals that are interested in everything to do with estate living. So one of the big discussions that have been happening since 2016 within the residential community environments is the topic that we're all here for today, which is fiber infrastructure. Now, as we all know, back in 2016, when it was a new technology, a lot of our estate management and community managers were learning on the go, just like you were. And there was a huge land grab and there was disinformation. And it did cause a few issues within the residential community environments. But over the last 4 years, with the help of, or 5 years, with the help of Digital Council Africa, we've able to educate our audience, we're able to share valuable information. And that's really what's brought us here today, is the topic that we're going to discuss today looks at infrastructure ownership. So we've almost done a bit of a U-turn. We didn't know what was happening initially. We brought on service providers, we brought in all the big telcos into our estates and into our environments. We then had this period of misinformation and very quickly have now sort of done a bit of a U-turn where we've stood back and said, well, to be able to deliver the services that our homeowners and residents required, should we take ownership of our infrastructure? And what does that really, really mean? And what is infrastructure? Is it the servitudes? Is it the fiber network? What does that really constitute? So bringing a panel today, we need to look at the big players in the industry. We've invited Malcolm Samuels, who is the general manager of Zimbiti Estate, Eco Estate down in KZN. They are really in the forefront of the estate evolution, if you can put it like that. It's a large estate, it's a beautiful wildlife environment, but they also have a very, very active homeowner resident. They've got a strong board, they've got a huge presence in the market, and within the residential community industry space, Malcolm Samuels is a member of the RCC, or the Residential Community Council. He's an active member of ARC, the Association for Residential Communities, and has a very, very good understanding of what's happening in the industry today. We've brought in the big player, as we all know, OpenServe, which in some of our estates might be considered a swear word. So we'll bring put Sunil in that hot seat later on during this discussion. And then a relatively new player within the residential community space, but offering what is a slightly different audience. So our affordable market, our high density spaces, our complexes, sectional title opportunities, and that's ATEC. So Rowan Luck's with us today. He's the Chief Operating Officer of ATEC. I'm sure many of you know him. He's a well-known figure within the telcos. And we're very, very glad that he's put the time aside today to join what might be a bit of a contentious issue, as Janita very kindly mentioned in our preamble before this discussion. And we've only got 45 to 50 minutes to really tackle a subject that's been going on for a number of years. So Malcolm, as the expert within the space representing residential communities across the country, maybe you could set the stage for us. Let's understand what's happening within residential communities. There's Rowan. Welcome to the party. There's no escaping. What is happening within residential communities at the moment? And maybe you could draw a little bit of a picture of where we're at so that we can build on this conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Louise, and good day, viewers. It's nice to be part of this panel, and quite a hot topic indeed, Louise, and thank you for setting this up. And thank you to my fellow panelists for coming on, braving this platform as well, because it's not an easy discussion, but also I think we're all in it to actually do better, and I think that's hopefully we can get to some better outcome from today's discussion. So just a bit of a background in terms of gated communities and the journey that's taken place within this space. It started off with I dare to say, a very terrible decision by the Constitutional Court allowing fiber service providers or connectivity service providers in that industry, based on the Electronic Communications Act, to be allowed complete access to servitudes throughout South Africa. In fact, it in one article that I read, it was dubbed a land grab or a expropriation of property for communications. And this particular court case, as high as the Constitutional Court, has allowed a lot of service providers, be it if I can name some names, the largest in the country, to small service providers running through a race to grab servitudes as an asset to their properties, or to their companies. And what's taken place is that we've had infrastructures or servitudes just being dug up throughout South Africa, some in gated communities, some outside gated communities. And with a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, and just with a court decision put on the table and said, well, we have unfettered or undue access or unrestricted access into servitudes within gated communities. Obviously, what are gated communities? Well, these are homeowners that buy into residential estates, and they'd like to take care of their verges, take care of their properties in a much more controlled manner. And therefore, they employ people like myself, and there's probably a few hundreds, if not thousands, of people in my positions throughout the country that actually get to manage the assets of homeowners that are bought into residential estates. And it does become a difficult challenge because the reason why these residents buy into these places was obviously to make sure that they have better value of property than what you would find in outside a gated community, and that includes a very well manicured garden or a very well manicured verge. And here you have a court decision that allows service providers to dig up their verges and to put them back in the way they feel right. So interesting to have Rowan and Sunil online with us on the panel. They could possibly shed some light in terms of how they've gone about doing what they're doing, and what are the ammunition or what are the handles that gated communities can have to actually get the service providers to do better.
So Malcolm, are you saying that you feel that the court will enable any service provider to come onto your estate and put a servitude in to run their fiber network? Correct.
So the Electronic Communications Act, and I'm sure if we have it, one of the guys know it better than I do. I think it was Section 22 of the Act that allows the license holder to construct an electronic communication infrastructure on the land of any person, provided that their due regard is. They've done it in a manner that's applicable to the laws of the country and the environmental policies that govern our country. And that is any place. It could be you on a farm. It could be a gated community. It could be a shopping center, and that's how I understand it, or how I've read it. And that's why you kind of have what's taken place in most parts of South Africa, where people have got into this race. They obviously have to apply to be a registered fiber operator, with ICASA, etc. And once that license has been given, they sub out the work to a civils company that generally digs up trenches, probably a meter deep, and lay out conduits for these lay out these conduit ducting, microducts as they call them, to allow fiber to be blown through that microducting. And that's taken place throughout South Africa, as far as I'm aware.
So, Malcolm, do you think that it gives in your opinion, based from the understanding that community management have, that it gives them the right to put in their own servitudes? Or do you think that this legislation is telling estate communities and HOAs that they need to give access to existing servitudes to telecommunication companies. And I think there's a little bit of a difference there, because in a community such as yourself, the infrastructure already exists. And in a lot of the residential developments, you know, companies, telecommunication companies have already put in infrastructure. And we're talking about existing developments, not new developments that are bringing in the infrastructure from the get-go. So did you feel that this was that you had no right to stop anyone from using your existing servitude? Is that what you've stopped?
Yeah, so Louise, what's taken place is that, and I'm glad to have Sunil online, is that you know, Telkom being probably one of the larger companies, being a parastatal before going into the private sector, being privatized, has had the privilege of having most of South Africa, if not gated, not just the gated communities, already had ducting laid within the most gated communities. And if we just talk about gated communities now, and we can expand to what's going on in South Africa, is that in gated communities, if you are building as a developer, if you're building an estate, you would basically ask for, in your civils program, ask for water, sewer, electricity, and for communication. So you would lay all those infrastructure out. And generally, the day of old was that Telkom was the only service provider for communications, because it was government owned. And they got to lay their ducting in. When this act came about, obviously Telkom seized that duct and said, well, this is our duct, therefore we're not going to share it with anybody else. Now, which locked most of the estates to possibly go with a Telkom based backbone, if you call it that way. However, the Communications Act challenged some other individuals, and that's where some other service providers decided to challenge the status quo and say that we want access to the ducts. And if an estate wanted the choice of going with a competitor to Telkom, they would have a problem, because they would have to then dig up the whole their servitude or their verges as well. And we found that we had this challenge by a competitor, and after several years, and this has been going on for a while, I'm glad to say, and if I can just jump down very quickly to the end of the situation, was that Telkom actually began to realize, listen, this is, if we don't share it, we're not going to get anything. And I'm glad to say that the guys have come to some realization that they rather share the manholes, not just the conduit, and allow us to just get access to the manholes. But Sunil could tell you how, I mean, there's different models that's going on in the country right now, where there are places where there were no Telkom ducting, and you had one of the other larger fiber operators dig up verges just because the act stated that, and put through fiber. And let's face it, most gated communities, your LSM is quite of the high end, and the fiber is a necessity in today's world. So the reality is that nearly everybody would like to watch Netflix and would need to communicate. And with the lockdown that we had with COVID, that was the only form of communication that most homes had.
So just to go back a step, so we understand the difficulty about access to the actual servitude or to the manhole, to the ducting, and that is a big issue that estates are dealing with as well, because of that sort of, the privatization of the land and the questions around that. But if we go back a little bit to look at residential community spaces now, we very much understand that the homeowners and residents within these spaces have a certain expectation about the service delivery within the residential community environment. And a lot of that pressure around service delivery is put onto the management teams. It's an enormous responsibility, and it's a lot of pressure. We know that definitely. So if the homeowners and residents of the estate are driving the initiatives to take ownership of the infrastructure, what is the key factors that is driving that? Is it always service delivery, Or are you finding that there are other services that you are not able to access, which are failing because you don't own your fiber infrastructure?
Louise, if you don't mind, I'd let Sunil comment. I think he wanted to comment on something, and I'm happy to answer that question after him, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Sunil, please jump in.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, so just by way of introduction, my name is Sunil Pyarlal. I'm the executive responsible for infrastructure planning and modeling in OpenServe. And just on the point that Malcolm's raised, I think we will need a whole new session to debate the Section 22 of the Electronic Communications Act. But just a correction there, Malcolm. So we don't have blanket to come into your estate. Estates are still regarded as private estates. But where we do have customers in that estate on legacy technologies, the Act allows us to come into that estate and upgrade their service to fiber. So that's the first point. So I think, I don't want to go into legislation, but I think what's important to note is that we don't have blanket access to all estates. We've got access to our customers. If we have a customer in Simbiti and he's on copper and he wishes to be upgraded to fiber, or if we wish to upgrade our infrastructure from copper to fiber, we then use Section 22 of the Act to get in if you refuse us access. So the homeowners association still, we have a process where we come to you and we ask you for access, a formal application. We then grant access. But where we have customers and you deny us access, we can then invoke Section 22 of the Act and gain access to our customers within your estate. That's the first point I wanted to clarify, Louise. And like I said, I don't want to go into a detailed discussion because we'll need an hour just for that alone. The second part of infrastructure sharing. So there's a lot of guidelines on sharing existing infrastructure. There's certain parts of our infrastructure that's regarded as essential facilities, and ICASA is busy regulating that. So we open to infrastructure sharing. We were never opposed to it. We believe that we can get economies of scale from both you deploying and us sharing with you, and from us deploying and us sharing with other fiber network operators. So the infrastructure is there. There is an opportunity to share existing infrastructure. And bear in mind that it did cost OpenServe or Telkom at that stage money to put that infrastructure in. So there's also guidelines on how we rent out that, whether it's long-run incremental costs or whether it's fully allocated costs for that infrastructure. But again, Louise, a debate for a whole new webinar. I think I want to focus here on ownership of infrastructure. But I just wanted to let Malcolm know that he's not out in the cold. We're not going to come there and dig up your facility and force you to give us access unless we have customers there and we want to update the infrastructure. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Sunil. So I want, I'd like to bring Rowan in. Then maybe he can make a comment to that statement as well. Rowan, are you finding that in your environment, homeowners and estates are asking to own the infrastructure? Is that something that's coming up more and more in recent times?
Okay, quickly by way of introduction. So my name is Rowan Luck. I'm the COO of ATEC, and we have a division called Fiber Suburb, which basically runs the network department or the network division in gated residential communities. And typically what happens where we get involved, we've been doing this for a lot longer than 5 years, Louise, but typically it's a private setup, and we're a solutions-based company. So our need or our scoping session in terms of what needs to happen starts with the developer or starts with the homeowners association or the estate manager, by example. And typically it comes to a need of our clients or our residents need connectivity. There's obviously a lot of bolt-on effects that we can incorporate into that. There's security, there's all sorts of other things, but typically communication is the first requirement, if I can put it that way. So it comes down to what the customer wants. Do they want to own the infrastructure or not? Typically, if they want to own it, there's something that needs to be paid for it. Malcolm knows this as well as many others that will be watching this. Homeowners associations are not for profit. So typically they don't have millions and millions of rands in the coffers to be able to facilitate and to provide a connectivity solution for their residents. So they then lean on a telecoms company, if you will, whether they have a choice in the matter or not. And typically it comes along the lines of, well, if we own it, how is it licensed? How is it managed? Is there a service level agreement? What happens if something goes wrong? Are there multiple internet service providers? Is there only one provider? You know, do we want to control the price point? There's a whole list of things that we have to go through to basically scope a specific solution for a community. Obviously, it's difficult, but it's a lot simpler to have that conversation with a governing body or a homeowners association or an estate manager. Typically, you wouldn't be able to do this in a non-gated community where you have a residents association that really don't have power over each other, if I can put it that way. But typically we find is that we have to sit and go through the wants and the needs and the requirements, and then we basically scope a list of solutions from there. So in terms of ownership, just to answer your question from a servitude point of view, 9 times out of 10, that's all owned by the state, because typically they'll own their own roads, their own infrastructure, their own security, their own water, all of those facilities or all those services are typically owned by the estate, and the majority of them want to own the servitudes for the fiber as well, but not necessarily the network itself. It really just depends.
So, Rowan, have you found that once you sit down with the estate and you explain to them the difference between owning the infrastructure and having manage or owning the network, or being able to monetize the network, which is really what it's about, do you find that once you've sat down with them that you bring a whole lot of new evidence to the forefront, things that they might not have necessarily thought of, and then therefore end up sort of not owning the infrastructure?
Yeah, it's really just it's a big thing about education. You know, fiber to the home is a great initiative. It is a bit of a contentious discussion in terms of availability, but the education around it, we feel we've only just scratched the surface. Again, Sunil will agree with me. We could probably have another webinar about all the different parts and the moving mechanisms, etc. But really, what it's about from an ownership point of view, it really is it's dependent on what is required. What we then sit down and say is, guys, this is what is the best practice with regards to your specific situation. Yeah, you know, we've been approached by OpenServe or by this company or this company, but we don't actually know what it means. So what we really do is we just educate. We give forward our recommendation in terms of what they should or shouldn't do. Hopefully they'll sign on with us because we can provide them with a service that has other bolt-on solutions. But what it will also do is it will enable them to make a decision going forward, that if we are not the company of choice, they now have some ammunition to go, okay, they don't have access to the Digital Council. They don't even know, you know, that they even exist, for argument's sake. If they're not part of the ARC Residential Communities Association, then they don't really know who to lean on to. But at least if we can give them that information to say, think about this like that, then at least there's a decision that can then be made.
Well, hopefully they're reading the information on Estate Living's site there.
Yeah.
Malcolm, you had a comment for Rowan? Would like
Yeah,
to
Rowan,
come in?
thank you, Louise. Rowan, thank you for that. And I think the industry is changing a bit, or I'd like to think that the industry is changing a bit. Something that we've embarked at Simbiti, but in particular, and Simbiti has an economy of scale, so sometimes might be easier to look at it in what I'm going to share with you next, is that with Simbiti having about 1,620 properties, we found there's more of a need to actually enjoy or own the servitude, but partner with a service provider or partner with a fiber service provider in particular to actually share basically the backbone. With 430 hectares, we are our own backbone, if you want to call it. And I do know that you know, there's Louise, you know, and these guys would be able to tell you their revenue share stream, basically from wherever wherever the fiber comes through, from basically a Seacom cable coming into the country, into a hub like Terraco, down into the little village of Bolito. There are layers of revenue streams as you get that fiber downstream. And being a largest gated estate as Simbiti is, we say, listen, we want a piece of that, which basically goes back to the homeowners. And Rowan's right. Being a non-profit company, you can't actually now be generating revenue. But there's been a drive specifically at Simbiti to look at how can we future-proof our levy base. As costs escalate over year on year, we are giving out a whole lot of money to the electricity department, to the water department, to the fiber department. These are all utilities. And if we could actually have a piece of that action, we'll be able to keep our levy base low, because basically that's what any rateable organization would look at. And that I think is where I would see most gated communities on a large scale be looking into. It keeps the regulators and the service providers a bit more competitive. So it's it's a revenue stream, but based on what's taken place in the last 5 to 7 or 10 years, it's a bit of a pickle or a mess, because you have service providers selling off their infrastructure, their assets, stuff that they deem that they have claim to. It's kind of a bit of a Wild West situation right now. I'm not sure if you would agree, Rowan, with both reputable and disreputable service providers.
Yeah, no, predicting what's going to happen in the future is tough to get that one right. And based on our success, where we sit is all based on partnerships and relationships. OpenServe is by no means the enemy. Neither are any of the ones in blue or red or yellow. We just have to find a way to work together and stick to what it is that we're good at. So we're good at specific niche, tailor-made, bespoke solutions for gated estates. OpenServe and Sunil they have a responsibility to the Department of Communications to bring fiber to the rest of South Africa, if I can put it that way. So their needs, their wants, their strategies are a lot different to what ours would be. So it's about having those conversations and figuring out what is best for everybody, in terms of trying to keep everybody happy, if I can put it that way. Which, Malcolm, being an estate manager, that is near to impossible to get that right. But if we could focus on the majorities, then at least we can. We've got a working model, if I can put it.
Sunil, you wanted to comment on that as well?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Some really interesting points raised there. Malcolm's talking about revenue streams, and Rowan's talking about owning the network versus owning the infrastructure. And I think it's important that we talk about what constitutes the infrastructure and what constitutes the network. So if you'd allow me, I just want to touch on the evolution of the FTTH network. I think it's an opportune point to do that. So if we look at the evolution of FTTH, the ownership of infrastructure versus the ownership of the network and ownership of the associated services, in the last 10 to 12 years, we've seen this ecosystem evolve. And there were times when estates tried to build their own infrastructure, like Malcolm wants to do, and they wanted to own the infrastructure. But the cost to maintain that infrastructure has become one of the biggest impediments, like Rowan was alluding to it now, especially for players who don't have the experience and don't have the expertise to ensure not only fulfillment, which is the provisioning of the service, and then the billing of it, but most importantly, the maintenance of that infrastructure. That is where most of these estates are coming back, not only to OpenServe, but to fiber network operators and to fiber network providers like Rowan, to rebuild that infrastructure and to manage and support that for them. So I think what the estates want, to Malcolm's point, they're looking for revenue streams. And I think they want to own the services that run over the network, like your security, your community access TV, your intercoms, your gate automation, etc. And at times they actually want to own the network, which is the pieces of network equipment like routers and switches and content distribution devices. But the actual infrastructure that these networks run on, the actual fiber that's in the ground, splitters that provide FTTH, the fiber access terminals and the optical network terminators, all of that is best deployed and best maintained by fiber network operators, not necessarily the homeowners association and the gated complexes. So what we've seen is typically the most successful homeowners associations are the ones who explore the different kinds of services that they want to give to their residents, while partnering with fiber operators who provide the infrastructure to facilitate these key differentiators. And I think that is an important point to bring in now, Louise. So Malcolm wants the revenue streams. He wants to create revenue streams for gated complexes. That doesn't come from owning the infrastructure, because owning the infrastructure opens you up to maintenance of that infrastructure, upgrading costs when you have to upgrade not only the active equipment and the infrastructure, but to upgrade that actual infrastructure. And I think Rowan might want to add to that as well, Louise.
Sunil, my understanding in my mind, the infrastructure would be basically the servitude, the ducting that's placed on the ground. I've always maintained that you let the guys that do what they do best do what they need to do, and that's if OpenServe or ATEC or any other service ISP or a service or backbone service provider runs a fiber optic cable, maintaining the asset of the switches that lands up to a point to a home, basically, and then allows the ISP to run that. And that's the partnership agreement I'm talking about, is that whoever manages that backbone has got a partner, and I say a backbone because it's, I think it's the second layer, has got a partner with an estate. Because there's things like, which I don't think that's taken, that a lot of these service providers that manages an FTTH network has taken into account. That's access to the network. That is the maintenance of the actual servitude and the landscaping. The security of service providers coming into the gated community. What is their credentials? You know, most of the service providers sub out to smaller companies to do their digging and their switches when they go out. So there's got to be a shared relationship, and we're saying, listen, based on that, there should be a shared income. Yes, there's and I think if OpenServe is open to that, excuse the pun, but the reality of that is that it allows more of a smoother transition than you allowing 2-3 companies coming in. You don't know who's coming into the estate. It creates a security risk. People opening up manholes where you don't, or trenching on verges, even an ISP trenching towards your switches, and creating a pop when there shouldn't be a pop. It becomes uncontrollable. And I think what you would agree, what we do best is actually manage the infrastructure on gated communities. That's our core jobs. Prior to the fiber industry being as ripe as it is now, you just had one communication network, and that was managed by the fact that, like your electrical, who's been coming into the estate, is managed by the local municipality, and within the municipality, they would actually work with the estate manager or community manager to actually access those services in a responsible way. And I think that's where the shared revenue stream we're talking about comes in, because there's layers of revenue, and I think we'll go into another discussion in terms of how much of those shared revenue streams are available out there, and it's quite competitive, and it's becoming more competitive, I believe. I think there are opportunities for both homeowners who will gain by that.
So to jump in here, so Malcolm, what you're saying essentially is that you as an estate would like to rent out your servitude.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we put in conduits, and that's what we are doing right now, is that we invest in long term, so that we don't have anybody, or everybody, I should say, coming up to dig up servitudes. We're going to we've laid conduits throughout the state, those microducts, and we'll rent out the microduct to a service provider that will offer us the best service, best rate, and that has a multiple of ISPs that are linked to them. Because there's a whole lot of other factors. I mean, there are some smaller guys out there that can only have a limited amount of ISPs on their backbone, versus larger guys that will have a myriad of ISPs. Then there's service providers that are already in discussions with people like MultiChoice to remove dishes of residents' properties, and to allow DSTV via a fiber network.
So, but in essence, if you're renting out the servitude to the telcos, whoever that might be, the cost eventually comes back to your resident.
Not necessarily if you've got a shared model, and the shared model is with whoever you're partnering with. So, for example, if I had to partner with OpenServe right now, OpenServe we would lay the conduit. They would blow the fiber through that conduit. They will maintain the network, the switches from the point of the fiber coming into the estate right up to the homeowner's property. And that last mile, basically on the myriad of ISPs that Sunil or OpenServe has on their database, a homeowner could buy into any of those packages that the ISP offers. So that backhaul, nobody knows who brings that cable to the homeowner's property. It's only the ISP, well, the homeowner doesn't. The ISPs are the ones that actually say, listen, okay, we are on an OpenServe network directly from Terraco into Simbiti because Simbiti went with OpenServe. Or if we chose Rowan, for example, ATEC, you would have, ATEC doesn't have cabling throughout the country. They would probably maybe use OpenServe outside Simbiti, and within Simbiti, they would own that network and will have a list of ISPs offered to the residents. And those residents will basically have access to only those ISPs that Rowan has on his network. That's my understanding of how your world works. So you guys welcome to correct me in that space.
But can I just jump in here? But Malcolm, that does lead to another issue that sits within the telco space, is the fact that you have multiple service providers blowing fiber through the same servitude. And that essentially dilutes the market for the telco. So if the HOA is renting out their servitude, would they be then open to exclusivity agreements, which would then prevent another telco from blowing fiber through it? And how does that, and maybe the guys could answer that question, is that are you legally allowed to prevent another fiber, a telco from blowing fiber through your servitude? Maybe Rowan can answer.
Absolutely. I mean, if the servitude belongs to us, we would obviously have an exclusivity network. But maybe the guys could answer the question regarding the legalities around it.
I'll let you answer that one, Sunil.
So there's not only regulation, but there's also a lot of municipal guidelines on single trench policy, on duct sharing. And owning the servitude is a very difficult conversation. That is open to legal interpretation because a servitude is registered against certain companies. But I think what you're referring to, Malcolm, is owning the ducting within that servitude. And if you want to go for that model, I think I don't think there would be much objection, provided you provide access to people to that. But to answer Louise's question, you cannot blow two separate providers' fibers in the same tube, or you cannot blow two of your own fibers through the same tube because you cause damage as you do that. And what you would normally do then is to put many tubes in if you have intention of sharing that trench or sharing that infrastructure with someone else. So I don't think you're going to find much opposition from fiber network operators to sharing trenches or sharing ducting, because we're seeing more and more of that happen recently. It reduces the cost of ownership. We're going to have more than one fiber operator in complexes, and that's the norm, and then you get the likes of Rowan, which is very specialized companies coming in for specific reasons, like providing security services or providing a select suite of services to your community. And they may either need access to the fiber operator's fibers, or he might want to roll out his own fiber, in which instance you'll have to then, lease out your ducting. But in terms of the legality of renting out the servitude, I think, we need to get a legal opinion on that, because I think once that servitude is registered against any operator or any company, then that servitude belongs to them. And whether you can share that servitude or not, I'm not in a position to answer that.
Yes, Sunil. I mean, what's interesting about this? Sorry, Rowan.
I can answer that based on our experience. So a lot of our companies, or a lot of the estates where we represent, they would have a shared servitude, if you will. Obviously, we want to push for exclusivity because it all works on economies of scale, and there's investments and there's return on investments, et cetera. But when it comes to sharing of the ducting, I think from a terminology point of view, not to get too stuck on the micro trenching or the whichever, the fact of the matter is there's a hole in the ground and there's separate pipes or conduits that each network would then occupy. Let's say, for argument's sake, a 110 sleeve. Instead of putting one in, put four of them in. Telecoms will go in this one, security will go in this one, telecoms company A or B or C or whichever, so that they are physically separate, if I can put it that way. Because the other issue or the other debate that will then be had, and OpenServe will attest to this, is that They've got a specific topology and a specific methodology of rolling out their networks. And that's different from the way that we do it, or it's different from the way that company X, Y, and Z does it as well. So to try and cater for the labyrinth of the changes that needs to happen because you want to make a single decision, it really just comes down to give them the space. They can then put in what they need to do in terms of what goes into that space. But going back to the estates where we've operated, we've just said, as long as the telecoms network is separated from the water or the electricity or the security network, et cetera, then it's not really an issue. But like I said, from ownership of servitude versus ownership of the network, you don't really want to be in the position of owning a network from a maintenance point of view. But there must be an agreement. Our success is based on the relationships that we have with the estate managers, with the trustees and the directors, so that there's an education and there's essentially a hand-holding with the residents, because the residents are holding you accountable as the estate managers. You know, they want to be sure that they have the best in practice. You know, something like Simbiti, you basically say, well, OpenServe can come in. Whether they will give you a revenue share or rent the ducts or anything from you is entirely up to them. I don't know if it's part of their model. But where it comes down to specific solutions, I'm not saying that Simbiti can't be demanding. I think they just need to understand where the parameters are and what can and cannot be done from a national program, if I can put it that way.
There is an assumption here, and I think that Simbiti has, Malcolm, and I stand to be corrected, do you own the roads within your estate?
Yes, we do. And we own everything on the estate is a private servitude. And hence the reason I started with the conversation regarding the Section 22 of that Act. It makes it it's very sketchy, and I don't think there was a lot of thought taken into account when the judge ruled in a constitutional court decision of what he actually ruled on, is that he basically made all the whole of South Africa accessible to anybody that's is registered with ICASA to have an FTTH license. And that means that the guys could go in and do that. And that's what gated communities are faced with. So for example, if I guess your question, Louise, is that based on the fact that it's a private servitude, then what right can people just go in and just dig up wherever they want to?
Or what is the opportunity, can, if you have public roads or public servitude, still rent out your servitude because it sits within your within your secured environment, part of the HOA. Yeah. So can you rent? Because if this is a model that estates can look at as a revenue driver, would the same apply for a Mount Edgecombe or Silver Lakes where they don't own their roads?
Well, I think it's more mainly that, so the verges, well, in most places, it depends on how the property is registered. So for example, our verges are registered as open space, as private, and our roads are also private. And that particular case, that a particular situation you're talking about at Mount Edgecombe was that there again, you had a judge that deemed all roads are public roads. That means even a road in the definition of the National Traffic Act says that a trolley, where a trolley is pushed, is deemed to be a road. So again, you have courts making a decision where it's very difficult to interpret on an application from an application point of view. The whole purpose of having a gated community is that you want to have a private estate. I don't think people would like the fact that tomorrow you would have you would want to open up your boom gates or your gates for the fact that we deem that, well, supermarkets are allowed to actually sell to any household or to deliver to any household. Therefore, they have a right to those households without being challenged to stop at the gate. That could again challenge that inertia. And so this is it's more of a bigger decision, more of a bigger understanding rather than just whether we are allowing servitudes to be built, to be erected. It's actually that government's allowing access to certain parts of the industry. Yes, homeowners need fiber to their homes. They need certain access to it. But I think we can do it in a more controlled fashion, like we've done with everything else.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry, Sunil, you wanted to comment on Rowan's statement?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So Rowan raised a very important point about network topology, and fiber network operators all have a different way of architecting their network. So they have a different network architecture. They have a different way of modeling their network. And I think that's important to understand. You know, Malcolm's the backbone that comes into the estate. We would generally not bring the backbone into the estate. We would only do the last mile distribution into the estate, whereas other operators may deploy that differently. So I think it's important to understand the way your network is architected before you start sharing that infrastructure. The second thing I wanted to add to that was, in our world, when I say our world, I refer to Rowan and myself as fiber network operators. Our infrastructure is the actual fiber and the pipe that the fiber runs through, not the road, not the servitude. You know, that is your infrastructure. The road is the infrastructure for the gated complex. And the other point I wanted to add there is, when I first provided service to any customer within your estate, by virtue of the fact that I provided service to them, a servitude is registered against your road. So I have access to that customer to either provide service to him, to upgrade his service, or to remove his service. So that infrastructure I have access to. And I think, Louise, there might be a good opportunity in the future to have a totally separate discussion on the implications of Section 22 of the ECT Act on gated complexes, because I don't think it is as bad as Malcolm thinks it is. You know, we're not going to go in, and when I say we, OpenServe specifically is not going to go into a private estate and start digging up and rolling out fiber. You know, if it's a greenfield estate and you don't want OpenServe or any other fiber operator in that estate, it's your choice. It's a private estate. But as soon as you've given me access in the past to deploy fiber, to deploy copper to a customer, I then have access to that customer to provide service, to maintain that service, and to upgrade that service. And that's where Section 22 of the Electrification Act comes in. And I think, you know, that's a totally separate discussion, a very interesting topic, but a separate discussion.
And Sunil, if there's no fiber there, then you would allow that customer, you would provide fiber to them, and you would dig up the trench, right?
So there's two things. If I've got an existing copper customer in that area, depending how I access him, generally I would use the same methodology to access. So if I'm getting to him through an overhead infrastructure through a pole, I would replace that copper with a pole. If pipes or one of our pipes or whoever the pipes belong to provide the copper service, I would run the fiber service to that customer. But if it's a greenfield, Simbiti is a brand new estate, OpenServe presence there, and you don't want me there, I won't come and force myself in there. I don't think the Act allows for anyone to come and force themselves there. So if it's greenfield and I don't have a customer, then it's fine. But if I have a customer there, then I have the right to upgrade his service.
And that's one customer over 1,620 properties. And if 10 of us or 50 of the service providers do the same thing?
Yeah, so that's an interesting conversation, because that is where the homeowners association decide who they want in there and who they partner with.
No, but
you can decide. I want to
50 people have one customer each.
Yeah, but how would they have got that?
And they don't want to share the duct.
Yeah, so interesting, because the only way 50 people would have got access to 50 customers is if you allowed them to do that.
No, it's open market. Any ISP can go and sell to anybody. It is this FTTH is an open market at the moment. But that's the point. I mean, we're talking about why we should privatize the network or the infrastructure, is so that we don't allow, because this is also to protect OpenServe from ATEC or the red, blues, and the greens, on the basis that if your cable's running through the same duct, you don't want somebody to go and snap your cable, because then it's because you're in competition to the same customer. And if you're providing a better service to your competition, to your competitor, the end customer will want to jump ship. And how do you do that? Just sabotage the cable when you're in the duct. So hence the reason I'm saying that it makes sense to actually have one service provider on a shared revenue system, and we manage the ducting. So we can,
Yeah, so if I can just make the last comment on that, Janita.
And and Rowan, I think, wants to come in here as well. I'm sure he has a comment on that statement.
So
Go-
basically, what
okay.
I wanted to get to is in terms of the, I don't want to get too much into the terminology, but typically what happens in these type of environments is that OpenServe is the network. They're not the internet service provider. And what they would do is what we would always want to try and encourage, let me put it to you that way, is that there's always one network. So there's a choice of multiple ISPs. You've got a resident that now says, well, I had Telkom as an ISP and I still want Telkom as an ISP. If I am operating the network as ATEC, then I need to make sure that Telkom is an ISP. We cannot stop them from becoming an ISP for interest sake. But if you had somebody coming in that didn't have a service prior, let's say someone now moves in and now they want to keep ISP X, Y, and Z. If OpenServe or if ATEC is the network, we can try and get that ISP involved on board. But if they don't want to participate, then there's not much that they can do. I think going to Sunil's comment and argument is that he's already servicing customers on his network. He, as an OpenServe, cannot light a connection. He has to have an ISP to be able to do that. The same way that Telkom would provide a service, or there's a myriad of ISPs in terms of choices. So I think what it comes down to is just a bit of a terminology that we need to just qualify, and perhaps we can put this in the notes when we do when we give some background context, Louise, is that yes, you want to have sharing of servitudes, but in the sense of where there's one network or only one or two or three networks, there's 100 different ISPs. You don't want to have multiple networks involved in this whole lot. You've got one. Let me put it to you this way: if you had a company that managed the network on your behalf of Zambiti, let's say it's XYZ, and they make sure that OpenServe or that ATEC is keeping to what they say that they need to keep to, that in my mind would be the best way to actually manage this whole lot. And like I said, going back to keeping residents happy, we get it all the time. I want this ISP. Mr. Customer, please understand, we do not try and exclude any ISPs, but they all have to be registered. They all have to have licenses. There are ISPs that don't conform to OpenServe or to ATEC's rules and regulations, and those are there for the protection of the resident as well as the estate. So there's a reason why certain ISPs are not on all the networks. It's really just about having the conversation. I think that's really where it starts.
And thank you so much, Rowan. And I think just, we're heading towards the end of this session. And there's one thing that we haven't actually brought to the front is that at the end of the day, what's driving the residential communities, changing networks or changing service providers or wanting to rent out servitudes is the homeowner and resident and investors in the estates. So service delivery seems to be one of the big sort of sparks that lights the fire for change. And if a certain network provider who might be putting the network, the infrastructure provider, so the person who owns the fiber network, if they are not maintaining and delivering the service all the time, 24/7, then the estate homeowners and residents complain. That's the kind of the long and the short of it. They complain and they say, we don't want X, Y, and Z company. We want a new company in. And the other big sort of problem, or the big challenge that estates have, is every time that there is a new board that comes into play at an estate, they then have their own preferred service providers, preferred network providers, and they also want to bring their own changes in place, and that then causes another layer of problems, especially if you have an SLA like you mentioned, Rowan, and you are delivering a service and you have committed, you put the fiber infrastructure in, you've spent all that money, and now you're trying to capitalize on it, and you have a new board that wants to bring a new service provider in. And these are all the kind of tangible moving facts that also affect how the service is delivered. And service is what they're looking for, especially in today's work from home economy, where people want that service just to do what we're doing today. So I think that this discussion that we've had has definitely got room for more discussion. I think that, Malcolm, you're onto something, renting out that servitude. But again, that will bring a whole myriad of new challenges to the Homeowners Association and to your role and responsibility specifically. Thank you so much, Sunil, for representing OpenServe and for challenging Malcolm, and Malcolm for challenging, and Rowan for sort of playing gatekeeper here and enabling us to understand that there are different things that we're talking about. There are different layers of technology and different solutions that are in the market. But what I think is the most pleasant is the fact that we are sitting here and we are talking about it. And I think that's the start of what we addressed right at the beginning of this discussion, is information and education. So thank you to the Digital Council for giving us this opportunity to represent today. And we hope that you have found this discussion interesting. If you would like to find out any more information, you're more than welcome to contact Janita Clark or myself, Louise, at estate-living.co.za, and we were happy to connect you with any of the panelists that were here today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we trust you enjoyed the session. Thank you to all our sponsors and partners for helping us bring this event to you. Please click on the next link to join the following session.